Did you know that Forfar, Scotland, was once home to a secret coven of alleged witches? Let's uncover the truth behind this captivating and horrifying legend. The year is 1661. Scotland is gripped by fear, not of war, not of plague, but of something far more insidious: witches. The town of Forfar, a quiet settlement in the east of Scotland, is about to become the stage for one of the country's most brutal witch hunts. Forfar in the 17th century was a small but significant borough in the Scottish lowlands, surrounded by farmland. It was home to a deeply religious and superstitious population who were living under the shadow of a harsh Presbyterian church. It's fair to say these inhabitants lived in constant fear of plague, famine and war, all of which had already taken their toll. Like many across Scotland, the people of Forfar believed that the devil walked among them. Misfortune was never just bad luck. It was a sign that someone had made a pact with Satan himself. This is unsurprising when you consider the church preached that witches were everywhere, corrupting good Christians. Anything and everything was blamed on the devil, including a recent harsh winter that destroyed crops, leaving people starving. And in the tight-knit communities, rumours spread like wildfire. Anyone slightly different was a potential suspect, but fear alone isn't enough to start a witch hunt. To truly fan the flames, you need a leader obsessed with the devil himself, and that's what Scotland had. King James VI, later King James I of England, believed witches were real, powerful and dangerous. In 1597 he wrote Daemonologie, a book that gave official methods to detect and execute witches. He also personally oversaw the North Berwick Witch Trials, which took place from 1590 to 1592, where over 70 people were accused. In a further mark of his insane beliefs, he claimed that witches called up a storm to try and sink a ship on which he was travelling. This claim sent a wave of fear across the country. If the king himself believed in witches, who dared question it? And in the small town of Forfar, this fear was about to spiral out of control. The hunt started with a single name, one accusation, one whispered suspicion. But fear is like a disease. It spreads, and soon the town of Forfar had turned on its own. Margaret Fife was the first, a poor widow known for her sharp tongue and a stubborn independence that didn't sit well with the men of the town. In a place where women alone were already suspect, Margaret's fierce self-reliance made her a target. She had no family to defend her, no powerful friends to vouch for her character. When a neighbour's cow fell ill and died, whispers spread like rot through damp wood. Who else could be to blame but the widow who lived alone, the one who never softened her words, the one who carried herself as though she owed nothing to anyone? The minister of Forfar was summoned. He questioned Margaret, pressing her to confess, but she denied everything. What power did she have over cattle? What sense would there be in cursing a neighbour's livelihood? But reason held no weight in a town already convinced of her guilt. Margaret was thrown into a cell, cold, damp and unforgiving. Days passed. Sleep was stolen from her, food withheld, the walls closing in as the questions never ceased. Exhaustion set in, her thoughts unravelling. When they asked again if she had made a pact with the devil, she did the only thing left to end her torment. She confessed, not because it was true, but because it was the only escape. Then came Isabel Inch, a woman with knowledge that made people uneasy. She was a healer, skilled in the old ways, knowing which herbs could soothe a fever, which poultices could draw out an infection. People sought her out in secret, desperate for her remedies when a loved one lay burning with sickness. But whispers spread as easily as illness. If her hands could heal, could they not also harm? Some muttered that her gifts were unnatural, that her knowledge had been granted by the devil himself. When the accusations came, there was no saving her. Isabel was dragged before the authorities, her wisdom twisted into evidence of witchcraft. The witch pricker was summoned, a man whose trade was built on suffering. He wielded a long, thin blade, which he used to search for the telltale sign of Satan's touch. They called it the witch's mark, a patch of skin that felt no pain. And when he drove his needle into her flesh, and she made no sound, it was enough. Proof, they called it, proof that she was not a healer, but a servant of darkness. It didn't matter that witch prickers were frauds. Their blades, their needles, their cruel theatrics weren't about truth. They were about power. And once they pointed their finger, your fate was sealed. If they said you were a witch, you were a witch. After days of torment, Isabel Inch broke. The pain, the fear, the relentless questioning, it all became too much. She confessed to consorting with the devil, but she wasn't going down alone. Under pressure, she gave them what they wanted. Names. Women she had supposedly seen at a midnight gathering, a coven assembled in the devil's name, and among those names was one that sent a shiver through the town. Helen Guthrie. Helen Guthrie was different. She wasn't a poor widow scraping by on her own, nor was she a desperate healer living on the fringes of society. She was the wife of a respected man, a woman with status, a place in the town. But status wouldn't save her, not when the hysteria had taken hold. The town believed she was more than just a witch. They believed she was their leader, the one who called the coven together, the one who whispered curses into the wind, summoning storms to punish her enemies, blighting crops, killing livestock. Unlike the others, Helen didn't confess immediately. She fought back, denying every accusation, refusing to break. But the men of Forfar were patient in their cruelty. The torture was relentless, calculated, designed to strip away her defiance piece by piece. And when there was nothing left but agony and exhaustion, Helen finally surrendered. She admitted to it all, meeting the devil, leading the coven, even dancing in the ruins of a kirk at midnight, because by then the truth no longer mattered. Of course, there was no proof, but proof was never needed in Forfar. As the accusations spread, the flames of hysteria burned higher, devouring more names with each passing day. Fear had taken root in Forfar, and no one was safe. It no longer took evidence, only a whisper, a grudge, or the misfortune of being noticed at the wrong time. Margaret Ogg had once quarrelled with the minister's wife, a minor dispute that should have been long forgotten, but when a child fell ill, Margaret's name was the first on their lips. Elspeth Bruce, a quiet woman who kept to herself, was said to slip through the streets at night, not as a woman, but as a cat prowling the darkness in service to the devil. Even John Taylor, one of the few men accused, could not escape suspicion. They claimed he had attended the devil's gatherings, stolen communion bread for rituals too terrible to name. Agnes Sparks's crime was leaving her employer's service. His misfortune afterward was enough to damn her. And Christian grief? She had done nothing more than speak to Isabel Inch before her arrest. That was enough. One by one they were accused. One by one they were locked away. And soon Forfar had built itself a prison full of witches. A trial should mean justice, a chance to defend oneself. But in Forfar, the trials were not about truth. They were about confession, and confession was only ever wrung from the broken. In 1661, Forfar's magistrates set out to rid their town of witches. They followed the same brutal pattern seen across Scotland, a pattern fueled by fear, superstition, and cruelty. There was no real investigation, no chance for the accused to defend themselves. If someone spoke your name in accusation, your fate was sealed. The trials were held in the Tolbooth, Forfar's grim prison and courthouse, a place where justice was neither fair nor merciful. No defence was permitted. Guilt was assumed from the start. Judges relied on confessions twisted from the accused through torment and on so-called witness testimony, often fabricated or given under duress. The church played a leading role in the proceedings, its ministers thundering from the pulpit that Satan's servants must be purged. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. That was the law of God. And in Forfar, there were plenty willing to enforce it. The trials were nothing more than a performance, a grotesque ritual designed to extract confessions, no matter the cost. And the first weapon in the arsenal was sleep deprivation. The accused were kept awake for days, sometimes a week, denied sleep until their minds shattered. The longer they went without rest, the easier it became to make them confess to anything. Guards prodded them, forced them to walk in circles, or bound them in excruciating positions. Many began to hallucinate, their exhausted minds conjuring demons from the shadows, and when they finally broke, when the lines between dream and reality blurred, they whispered what their captors wanted to hear. Then came the pricking. It was said that every witch bore the devil's mark, somewhere on her body, hidden among freckles, scars, or birthmarks. A patch of skin where no pain could be felt, where no blood would flow. And so they searched. The accused were stripped and examined. If the spot failed to bleed, or if the prisoner did not cry out, it was declared proof, a sign that Satan himself had claimed them. But the prickers were not men of faith or justice. Many were frauds, travelling from town to town, selling their services for a price. Some used retractable needles, disappearing harmlessly into the handle of the blade. Others pressed so hard that the victim's skin went numb, ensuring silence when they drove the pin in again. It didn't matter how the evidence was found. The only thing that mattered was that it was found, and once it was, there was no escaping the noose. Some were cut, stabbed, and branded until they confessed. Others never even made it to trial. For those who refused to confess, who clung stubbornly to their innocence, there was another method, one designed to break both body and spirit. The witch's bridle. A grotesque iron mask, fitted with sharp metal spikes that pressed into the mouth, cutting the tongue, digging into the cheeks. It silenced the accused, stripping them of even the ability to plead for mercy. Helen Guthrie wore it for days, unable to eat, unable to drink, unable to speak. The iron bit into her flesh with every movement, the pain constant, gnawing, and inescapable. The humiliation was just as cruel. Shackled, gagged, paraded as a spectacle, she was proof that even a woman of status could fall under the devil's spell. No one endured it for long. The pain, the thirst, the sheer exhaustion reduced them all to husks of themselves. In the end, everyone broke, either in mind or body. One by one, they confessed, not because they were guilty, but because no one could endure the pain forever. With their confessions secured, pulled from them through torment and exhaustion, the court needed only one last thing to seal the accused's fate: witnesses. But in Forfar, a witness didn't need to have seen anything at all. Some claimed they had watched the accused slip into the night, only to return as a black cat, a hare, or a crow, beasts that witches were said to inhabit when they travelled to meet the devil. Others swore they heard strange whispers through the walls, voices calling upon dark forces, though they never could quite say what had been spoken. But the most damning testimony of all, that came from the mouths of children. Terrified, coached, or eager to please, their words carried a weight that no adult could deny. A child pointing a trembling finger, swearing they had seen Margaret Ogg hex a baby, or Helen Guthrie consorting with shadowy figures at the crossroads, was testimony enough. It didn't matter if it was truth or fantasy. It didn't matter if the children understood the cost of their words. The court believed them, and that was enough to condemn the women. And so the trials ended exactly as they had begun, with more names, more confessions, and soon more deaths. With the guilty condemned, there was only one thing left to do: burn them. For the witches of Forfar, a guilty verdict was never in doubt. The only question was how many would die. Helen Guthrie, Margaret Fife, Isabel Inch, and 6 others were sentenced to death. The court declared them guilty of witchcraft, consorting with the devil, and cursing the land. Their punishment: death by strangulation and fire. Some onlookers jeered, some crossed themselves, others watched in silence, but no one, not one soul, dared to protest. The execution site was outside the town walls, a place where the devil's servants could be burned away from Christian land. Each of the women was tied to a wooden stake, their feet resting on bundles of dry wood. A minister stood nearby, urging them to confess their sins one last time. But they had nothing left to confess, nothing to say. Their fate was already sealed. Strangulation was supposed to be a mercy, a quick death before the fire. But in Forfar, mercy was in short supply. Some were strangled before the fire was lit, their lifeless bodies burned afterwards. Others were still breathing as the flames consumed them. It's said the smell of burning flesh filled the air, clinging to the town for days. It was done. The witches of Forfar were gone, but the fear, that remained. Forfar had rid itself of witches, or so they thought, but in the weeks that followed, something lingered, a quiet unease, a sense that the devil had not been cast out, but invited in. Some of Forfar's inhabitants felt guilt, but dared not speak of it. Families of the executed were shunned, as if the devil's curse lived on in their blood, but the trials didn't end. More accusations followed in the years to come. In time, even those who condemned the so-called witches began to whisper, was it justice, or had they burned innocent women? History would remember the Forfar witches, but not as demons, not as monsters, only as victims of fear, ignorance, and of a world that saw women's power as something to be feared. The witch trials of Forfar were not unique. Across Scotland, Europe, and the world, thousands of people were accused, tortured, and executed, all in the name of superstition. But what does this tell us about human nature, about fear, and perhaps more chillingly, could something like this happen again?